The sand of Iwo Jima was black, like ashes from a fire that had never gone out, and Jack Lucas was only 17, but his eyes had already seen more death than most men twice his age. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and gunpowder, so dense it coated the back of his throat with every ragged breath, and the screams of dying men mixed with the staccato rhythm of machine gun fire until sound itself became a weapon. Jack pressed his body against the volcanic rock, his rifle, almost as tall as he was, clutched in hands that had only stopped shaking 2 days ago, and he thought briefly of his mother back in North Carolina, who still believed he was in high school, not crouched in a trench on the edge of hell. He had been 14 when he forged her signature on the enlistment papers, his voice still cracking when the recruiter asked his age, and he'd said 17 with all the false confidence of a boy who wanted desperately to be a man. 3 years of training, of becoming something harder and sharper than the child who'd walked into that recruitment office, and now here he was at 17, actually 17 this time, on a godforsaken island where the Japanese defenders would rather die in their tunnels than surrender, and where every inch of ground cost American blood. The morning of February 20th had started with naval bombardment that shook the earth like the anger of God, and then they'd gone over the top, scrambling across terrain that offered no cover, only craters and the twisted corpses of Marines who'd tried the same thing minutes before. Jack's unit had managed to reach a network of trenches, a small victory that felt hollow when you could still hear the screams of the wounded being cut down by sniper fire, and they'd hunkered down, trying to catch their breath, trying not to think about what came next. That's when he saw them. 2 small, dark objects arcing through the smoke-filled air, tumbling end over end with a casual inevitability. Like stones skipped across water. Grenades. Time didn't slow down the way people said it did in stories. If anything, it sped up, condensed into a single heartbeat that contained everything: the recognition of danger, the calculation of distance, the realization that his brothers, the men he'd trained with and fought beside and shared his last cigarette with, were about to die. Jack didn't think about the Medal of Honor or heroism or any of the grand words that would later be used to describe what happened next. He thought only of Tommy, who talked about his girl back home every night, and of Sergeant Davis, who'd kept Jack from getting court-martialed for sneaking aboard the transport ship, and of all the others whose names he knew as well as his own. He moved, hurled his body forward in a desperate dive that was more instinct than decision, and landed on top of the first grenade just as his hands found the second, pulling it beneath his chest. For a fraction of a second, he felt the cold metal against his uniform, and then the world exploded. The blast lifted him, tore through him, turned his body into a constellation of pain so absolute that it transcended sensation and became something else entirely. A white-hot erasure of everything he'd ever been. Shrapnel carved through his arm, his chest, his thigh, each piece of metal, writing its own story of destruction in his flesh, and he felt his ribs crack, felt something vital tear inside him, felt the warmth of his own blood spreading beneath him like a blanket. The silence that followed was worse than the explosion. A ringing, empty void where sound should have been, and Jack tried to move, tried to call out, but his body wouldn't respond, as if the connection between his mind and his limbs had been severed. He could taste copper and ash, could see nothing but red-tinged darkness, and somewhere in the distance, he heard voices, muffled and strange, saying words he couldn't quite understand. "Jesus Christ, he's alive. How is he alive?" someone said, and Jack wanted to answer, wanted to ask if the others were okay, if his sacrifice had meant anything, but his mouth wouldn't form the words. Hands touched him, rolled him over with agonizing care, and he saw faces swimming above him. Davis, Tommy, others he didn't recognize. All of them staring at him like he was a ghost, and maybe he was. Maybe he died and this was whatever came after. But the pain was too real, too insistent, for this to be anything other than life. The medics worked on him in the trench, their hands moving with frantic efficiency as bullets whined overhead, and Jack drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of reality. Someone cutting away his uniform, the sharp sting of morphine, the sensation of being lifted onto a stretcher. And through it all, he kept trying to ask, did they make it? When he finally woke, days or weeks later, time had lost all meaning. He was on a hospital ship, the gentle rocking of the Pacific beneath him, and a doctor with kind eyes was telling him they'd removed over 200 pieces of shrapnel from his body, that he'd lost more blood than anyone thought a person could lose and survive, that he was, by all accounts, a medical miracle. "Your men?" Jack whispered, his voice raw and broken. "Are they alive?" the doctor said, and something in Jack's chest loosened. A weight he hadn't known he was carrying finally lifting. "Every single one of them because of what you did." Months of recovery followed. Painful surgeries, hours of rehabilitation, nights when the phantom sensation of those grenades beneath his chest woke him screaming. But on October 5, 1945, Jack Lucas stood before President Harry Truman, his uniform crisp and new, hiding the scars that crisscrossed his body like a map of his sacrifice. The Medal of Honor felt heavy around his neck, heavier than those grenades had been, because it represented something Jack wasn't sure he could carry. The weight of being called a hero when he'd only done what any Marine would do, what he'd been trained to do, what love for his brothers demanded. He was 17 years old, the youngest Marine to ever receive the Medal of Honor, the only man to survive jumping on 2 grenades, and as the flashbulbs popped and the ceremony proceeded with military precision, Jack thought about that moment in the trench, about the choice that wasn't really a choice at all, about how being a hero just meant loving something more than you loved your own life. He would go on to live for decades more. Attending college on the GI Bill, building a business, even re-enlisting when the Korean War broke out because some part of him would always be that 17-year-old Marine. But the scars never faded, not the ones on his body or the ones deeper down, and he would spend the rest of his life insisting he wasn't special, wasn't brave, was just a kid who did what had to be done. But on that black sand beach in 1945, when Jack Lucas threw himself on 2 grenades and, somehow, impossibly survived, he became something more than a man. He became a testament to the kind of courage that doesn't calculate odds or consider consequences, the kind that acts purely out of love, and in that moment of absolute sacrifice, that 17-year-old boy with the forged enlistment papers and the too big rifle became eternal, a reminder that heroism isn't about living forever, it's about being willing to die so that others might live, and sometimes, just sometimes, fate decides that kind of love deserves a miracle.